Statement. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I turn to the European Council, I'm sure the whole House will join me in sending our very best wishes to the former Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott. All our thoughts are with him and his family at this time, and we wish him a full and speedy recovery. Mr. Speaker, last week's European Council focused on climate change, disinformation and hybrid threats, external relations, and what are known as the EU's top jobs. The UK has always been clear that we will participate fully and constructively in all EU discussions for as long as we are a member state, and that we will seek to continue our cooperation on issues of mutual interest through our future relationship after we have left. And that was the spirit in which I approached this Council. Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, the UK became the first major economy in the world to commit to ending its contribution to global warming by 2050. And I'm pleased that the regulations to amend the 2008 Climate Change Act, which are being debated in this chamber later today, have received widespread support from across this House. But ultimately, we will only protect our planet if we're able to forge the widest possible global agreements. That means other countries need to follow our lead and increase their ambitions as well. At this Council, the UK helped to lead the way in advocating for our European partners to follow suit in committing to a net zero target by 2050. While a full EU-wide consensus was not reached, a large majority of member states did agree that climate neutrality must be achieved by 2050, and I hope we can build on this in the months ahead. In the margins of the Council, I also met Prime Minister Conte and discussed the UK's bid to host next year's UN Climate Summit, COP26, in partnership with Italy. This will continue to put the UK at the heart of driving global efforts to tackle the climate emergency and leave a better world for our children. Turning to disinformation and hybrid threats, we agreed to continue working together to raise awareness, increase our preparedness, and strengthen the resilience of our democracies. I welcome the development of a new framework for targeted sanctions to respond to hybrid threats. This sends a clear message that the UK and its EU partners are willing and able to impose a cost for irresponsible behaviour in cyberspace. Mr. Speaker, we must also make more progress in helping to ensure that the internet is a safe place for all our citizens. That is why we are legislating in the UK to create a legal duty of care on internet companies to keep users safe from harm. And this will be backed up by an independent regulator with the power to enforce its decisions. We're the first country to put forward such a comprehensive approach, but it isn't enough to act alone. So, building on the Christchurch Call to Action Summit, the UK will continue to help drive the broadest possible global action against online harms, including at the G20 in Japan later this week. In the discussion on external relations, the Council expressed its concern over Russia's issuing of passports in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and reiterated its call for Russia to release the Ukrainian sailors and vessels captured in the Kerch Strait in November last year. Russia has consistently failed to deliver its commitments under the Minsk agreements and continues its destabilising activity. So, with the UK's full support, the Council agreed a 6-month rollover of Tier 3 sanctions, which include restrictions on Russia's access to EU capital markets, an arms embargo, and restricting cooperation with Russia's energy sector. In marking the 5th anniversary of the downing of flight MH17, we also welcomed the announcement from the Netherlands that criminal charges are being brought against 4 individuals, and offered our continued support in bringing those responsible to justice. The Council also expressed serious concerns over Turkey's drilling activities in the eastern Mediterranean. The UK has made it clear to Turkey that drilling in this area must stop, and our priority must be to see the situation de-escalated. In the margins of the Council, I also raised the issue of Iran. We're calling on Iran to urgently de-escalate tensions, and our priority remains finding a diplomatic solution to the current situation in the region. Mr. Speaker, a substantial part of the Council focused on what are known as the EU's top jobs, namely the appointments of the next presidents of the EU's institutions and the EU's High Representative. This is, of course, primarily a matter for the 27 remaining EU member states, so I've been clear that the UK will engage constructively and will not stand in the way of a consensus among the other member states. But it is also in our national interest that those appointed are constructive partners for the UK, as well as successful leaders of the EU's institutions. The UK supports President Tusk's approach to create a package of candidates across the top jobs, which reflect the diversity of the European Union. As there was no consensus on candidates at this meeting, the Council agreed to meet again after the G20 this coming Sunday, as well as holding further discussions with the European Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, while I had originally anticipated that this would be my final European Council as Prime Minister, I will in fact have one more. Finally, Mr. Speaker, President Tusk and President Juncker updated the remaining 27 member states on Brexit. This scheduled update was part of the agreement I reached in April to extend the Article 50 deadline for our departure from the EU to the 31st of October. The Council repeated its desire to avoid a disorderly Brexit and committed to work constructively with my successor as Prime Minister. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I understand it's 10 years since you assumed the chair of the House this week. Could I just say congratulations on the first 10 years? And thank you for being such a popular speaker and taking the role of Parliament in a very meaningful way out to the public, particularly to schools and colleges all over the country. It's made a very big difference. And I also thank the Prime Minister for the very kind words she said about John Prescott. We all obviously wish John all the very best. I can't wait to see him back in full activity with that booming voice out from loudspeakers with me all over the country, exciting people in the cause of Labour, which is what John does so well. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of her statement. Last week, we came within minutes of the USA launching a military attack on Iran. Britain and other European nations must play a role in diffusing, not raising tensions, and it needs to start with the restoration of support for the Iran nuclear deal. We note that there will be continuing EU-Morocco trade discussions. I hope the United Kingdom government will recognise there is an ongoing territorial dispute over the Western Sahara and that those issues will be borne in mind during those negotiations. I would also like to echo what the call by the European Union for Turkey to cease its illegal drilling in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I welcome what the Council said on that. Can I also, Mr. Speaker, welcome the EU Council's discussion of climate change, which emphasises how important it is to continue to work with progressive forces on tackling the climate emergency, which was indeed declared by this House on May the 1st. I welcome the EU's continued commitment to the Paris Climate Change Agreement and to deliver a practical plan of action to meet those obligations, and I welcome that COP26 will be jointly hosted by Britain and Italy, and some of its events will be held here in London. Yesterday marked 3 years since the EU referendum. 3 wasted years in which the government's deal has been rejected 3 times. We've endured 3 separate Brexit secretaries and will soon have our 3rd post-Brexit Prime Minister. 3 years of chaos, infighting and incompetence. For too long, the Prime Minister allowed herself to be held to ransom by the wilder extremes in her party, rather than trying to find a sensible majority across the House. Well, some of the wilder extremes have absented themselves today, but no doubt they're making their views heard somewhere else. By the time the Prime Minister did finally reach out, it was a bit too late. She was not able to deliver any meaningful compromise or change. So does the Prime Minister now regret that instead of warning of its disastrous implications, she continued to legitimise the idea of no deal? The 2 Tory leadership candidates are still saying that if they can't renegotiate the backstop, which the EU leaders said was not possible last week, then they would pursue a no-deal exit. Will the Prime Minister tell us whether she believes whether no deal should be on the table as a viable option? And, in her view, what would be worse, crashing out with no deal in October or putting the issue back to the people for a final say? Given the shambolic Mr. Speaker, it is normal for the Leader of the Opposition to ask questions of the Prime Minister, and that is exactly what I'm doing at the present time. Mr. Speaker, given the shambolic no-deal preparations so far, which were paused in the spring, can the Prime Minister confirm that the government will not be ready to crash out in October? Neither of the Tory leadership candidates have a credible plan. One even claims we can crash out on WTO terms and still trade without tariffs. Interesting. The Governor of the Bank of England was clear when he said, and I quote, "Not having an agreement with the EU means that there are tariffs because the Europeans would have to apply the same rules to us as they apply to everyone else." Could the Prime Minister confirm the Bank of England's Governor's analysis is correct on no deal? The former Foreign Secretary also told us that under his no-deal plan he could, and I quote, "solve the problem of free movement of goods in the context of the free trade agreement and that will negotiate in the implementation period." Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister confirm that if there is no deal, there will not be an implementation period? It is deeply worrying that those who seek to lead this country seem to have no grip on reality. The Prime Minister... The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, said the Council reiterated its wish to avoid a disorderly Brexit. I'm not sure they will have been reassured by the statements of her potential successors. Labour put forward a plan that could bring the country back together, but the Prime Minister refused to compromise. Whoever the next Prime Minister is, they will barely hold the support of this House, so they certainly have no mandate to force a disastrous, hard-right Brexit on this country. And I make it very clear, Mr. Speaker, Labour will work across this House to block no deal. Quite right. But whatever plan the new Tory leader comes up with, after 3 long years of failure, they should have the confidence to go back to the people and let them decide the future of this country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, may I say it is absolutely right that we recognise the fact that it is the 10th anniversary of your election to the chair as Speaker. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't seem like 10 years at all. So it's very... Can I correct the leader of the opposition on one? Surely, because the leader of the opposition made the point that he thinks reality and facts are important. He said that we had actually got the COP26 coming to the UK jointly with Italy. In fact, we are making a joint bid with Italy. There are still others who are bidding for COP26, so we're still working hard, and I was encouraging those around the EU Council table to support the bid that we have put forward. Now, well, I'm grateful the Leader of the Opposition from the Secretary position says that the Labour Party and the Opposition support that bid, and I'm grateful for that. I think it will be supported across the whole House. Now, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that in fact the European Union Council meeting that I attended did not discuss Brexit, no deal, or the views of the leadership candidates in the Conservative Party's leadership election, which is what the Leader of the Opposition focused the majority of his comments and questions on. So I am actually supposed to be talking about what happened at the EU Council. Nevertheless, I'm in a generous mood. So I will respond to a small number of the points that the Right Honourable Gentleman made. He talked about the talks that we had to try to find a compromise and a majority across this House. We did indeed enter those talks. I think both sides entered those talks in a constructive spirit. I would remind the Right Honourable Gentleman that it was he who actually terminated those talks. He has talked about the position in relation to no deal. No deal is the default option. Legally, it is the default option. that remains there on the table on the 31st of October if a deal is not agreed, and the government rightly is continuing its preparations for no deal. He asks about my view on no deal. I wanted to leave on no deal at the 31st of October. I wanted to leave the European Union on the 29th of March with a deal. If the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues had voted with the government on that, we'd already be out of the... And just to reiterate that point and remind him, I've done everything to avoid a no-deal Brexit by voting for a deal 3 times this year. He's done everything to increase the chance of no deal by voting against a deal every time. Rejecting any Brexit deal risks the worst outcome, a no-deal Brexit. Those are not my words, they are the words of his own Labour members of Parliament. And then finally, the Leader of the Opposition talked about people on this side of the House being divorced from reality. I have to say, the person who's divorced from reality in this House is a Leader of the Opposition who thinks the economic model we should be following is Venezuela.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.